Okay, well, thank you. Make a start. Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming along. I'm delighted that we're able to attract the crowd during this time of the semester. I've great pleasure in introducing Alison, who's visiting from Plymouth in the UK. In case you don't know Plymouth, it's down in the deep south. It's almost a day's trek to get down there, isn't it, from London?
It is, yeah.
So it's and Alison's only over here for about 10 days. So it's a flying visit. She arrived last Friday and just about over the jet lag. And I'd like to say that this event today is co-hosted by the Australian Sociological Association Risk Society's thematic group and sociology here at Monash. And I'd just like to say a little bit about Alison. Alison's got a background in media and risk, and she's worked in the area of environment and risk in media for some time now. And just about completed, well, I think she has completed a book. It's about to be published, on media, environment and network society. Have I got it right?
That's right, yeah.
And she's also editor of a journal called Environmental Communication. And we worked together for probably about 10 years on and off on the project on nanotechnologies and the media, looking at news production processes. Alison's also interested in issues around climate change, which is very untopical here at the moment. She's been forewarned, but it's still topical in the UK. And she's also done some work, it's not listed in her bio here, around fox hunting.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
I remember it was quite a big issue there for a while. They tried to stop it, but there's a bit of a class warfare over that. We don't have class warfare over foxes, but we have them over various other things. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Alison, and the title's up there, Environmental Risks in the Network Society. So thanks very much, Alison.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm going to begin with a bit of shameless self-promotion of my new book, which, in case you hadn't realised, is this book here. So if you're interested maybe in finding out further details, I've got some details there with a slight discount, although you may well prefer to get the ebook later on. So in this talk, I'm just going to focus on one particular aspect that I cover in the book, which is around looking at the controversy over the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster. And I wanted to kind of begin with sort of just setting the scene in terms of the kind of theoretical discussions that I've been particularly interested in, and how I see the book as kind of moving the field forward. So in the book, there are several different chapters focusing on a number of different case studies. There's one on climate change, there's one on emerging technologies, and what I'm going to be talking about today is the chapter that focuses on oil spills and crisis communication. And I've been particularly interested in the work of Beck and Castells, particularly Castells' recent work on the network society. And both of those leading theorists see the media as being absolutely central to the communication of risk. But they both paint a very broad-brushed account of the role of the media. I mean, they cover a tremendous number of different issues in their publications. And in my book, what I'm seeking to do is to kind of go beyond some of their initial theorising and account for the complexities and the nuances in terms of how different media cover different environmental issues. And there are a number of key questions really that I'm attempting to answer in the book. There are three in particular that I consider that I'll be talking about today. So one is, to what extent does media visibility equal influence? So how far does media visibility necessarily translate into real influence in terms of the policy making arena? The second question, Has the digital revolution really given alternative framings a greater voice? You know, it's often claimed that the digital revolution is going to completely democratise things. Well, has it actually happened? Looking specifically at this case study. And then thirdly, how do some actors seek to keep issues off the agenda? So I'm as interested in looking at how news sources try to silence issues as I am in terms of looking at their coverage in the media. So I particularly focus on news production processes, which I think is something that Castells and Beck tend to overlook in their work, but actually is a really important area to consider. I'm sure you remember this phrase from Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, when he said, "I'd like my life back." One of the many gaffes during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill crisis. And of course, 11 crew members, 11 men lost their lives. And, you know, Tony Hayward saying, well, I want my life back, you know, I've had enough of this. Rightly angered a number of people, really, in terms of, you know, how BP were downplaying what had happened, and also the huge environmental consequences of the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, which is, you know, said to be the worst oil spill that has affected not just the States, but across the world. So to begin with, just by talking briefly about Castells' recent book on communication power and looking at what he says about networks, because I think this is important in terms of understanding some of the changes that have occurred over recent decades in terms of the power of the media. Castells really suggests that power is located within the networks within society. So not in the actual institutions, not in the multinational corporations, or even the state, but within these networks between people in various different groups. And he's not talking about people so much acting as single actors. He's talking about people forming strategic alliances, and that's where power really operates. And the media, of course, is a place where these struggles take place. Now, some of what Castells has to say in the Network Society is really quite optimistic about the digital revolution. And this ties in with the work of Clay Shirky in his book that was published in 2008 called Here Comes Everybody, which, you know, talks about endless possibilities for digital media, for citizens to organise, new communities to form, and democracy ultimately to be enhanced through things like Wikipedia. You know, we can all contribute potentially to knowledge being generated. But has the digital revolution really empowered ordinary citizens to bring about lasting change en masse? That's one of the questions I'm interested in. Or does it actually encourage people to engage in a more passive way through simply clicking on links, liking things on the internet, you know, which is commonly be referred to as slacktivism or clicktivism? So although perhaps we have the illusion that, you know, citizens are being able to be empowered, you know, is it really happening? How much power do big corporations still wield? And are governments getting much better themselves at co-opting these tools? So that just gives you some of the background to some of the things that I'm interested in looking at in the book. Now, for Manuel Castells, mass self-communication is something that he sees as potentially being revolutionary. This ability of ordinary people to communicate via blogs, via Twitter, wikis and so on, and the potential for this to be consumed by a global audience. And for Castells, the meta-programmers are the owners of the multimedia business networks, people like Rupert Murdoch, for example, who are the key switchers, or what he calls switchers, in multimedia business networks. Now, these multimedia business networks typically have cross-membership of boards that involves not just members of the media, but also industry as well. And they are critically important in the processes of agenda setting and gatekeeping. In other words, what I'm talking about here is the ability of news workers to decide what gets in the news, and what is left out, which of course is influenced by journalistic conventions, news values, and oil spills often, not always, but they often fulfill these news values, especially if scandal is involved, especially if there are lots of visual images of oil-drenched birds and so on that are seen as being something that resonate with public identity and so on. The key switchers in the network society are members of the media, particularly owners such as Rupert Murdoch. So if we move on now to consider particularly what happened during the Deepwater Horizon crisis, there's been some interesting work that was carried out by Pew in the US, who looked at how much coverage the oil spill got. And as you can see here, it actually overtook the economic crisis and the 2010 elections. And there was a huge amount of coverage, particularly on cable TV. It dominated it day after day after day. Tremendous amount of coverage. And what was interesting was that often with this kind of disaster coverage, you get a lot of coverage in the initial weeks and then it subsides. But that didn't happen with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It just kept on going and going. So the sheer longevity of the coverage was something that you often don't see. And Obama's involvement clearly played a part in that. And work that's looked at that's sought to analyse who has been quoted the most in the coverage, has found, not surprisingly, that Obama was the most quoted person, as you might expect. Second person after that was Tony Hayward. Also, Pew Research Centre carried out some research into who people, American citizens this is, said that they trusted the most at the beginning of June 2010. So the spill occurred on the 20th of April, so a little bit of time had elapsed since then. And as you can see, the highest level of trust was in news organisations and relatively low levels of trust in BP and especially in federal government. So what kind of media response did BP take to this? Well, there's been some really interesting work that's been done that's looked at this. And what it basically shows is that initially BP really sought to distance itself from the oil spill and basically try to downplay the extent to which damage occurred as a result. Now, what happened to begin with was that it invested very heavily in mainstream traditional media. It ignored, online sources to begin with. And it placed full-page adverts in major US newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. It took on somebody called Anne Coulton, the former spokesperson for Dick Cheney and former head of public affairs at the US Department of Energy, as its head of media relations. And if you look at how much money it spent on this campaign, we're talking about huge sums of money. On the 4th of June, it launched a major television advertising campaign featuring Tony Hayward saying, "We will make this right." And I'm going to talk about this in a bit moment, but it also purchased key search terms which would bring up BP as the main sponsored link, which I think is very interesting in terms of how it sought to manipulate where people got their information from. So in terms of its use of social media, it was very late to actually really make much impact because NGOs, Greenpeace and so on had kind of used online sources very early on and generated a lot of interest. BP was so slow to use social media, it took them 7 days to send out a tweet. And already, there was a lot of anti-BP feeling welling up on Twitter. And when it did use Twitter, it used it in a very kind of old-fashioned way, really. It hadn't really adopted to this medium. So the first tweet that it sent out was in capital letters. Anybody that uses Twitter knows that, that's not really how you do it. And it used it as a one-way channel of communication. So it didn't retweet what other people had tweeted. It didn't respond. It didn't follow anybody. So it wasn't interactive. There's no sense of any kind of dialogue going on. It was just a one-way form of communication. And the other thing was that it tended to publish press releases syndicated to Twitter as well. So it wasn't really building up much of an engagement with people on Twitter. And as you'll see, that was in great contrast to the way in which environmental groups were organising around this in protest. Its YouTube page wasn't started until a month into the disaster. And when they did use YouTube, it's very interesting, they used it as though YouTube was just like a traditional television advertisement. So again, it wasn't suited to the technology. They were using it as a one-to-many form of communication rather than, using it in dialogue. And they also tended to turn off the comment function on social media, which, just tended to perpetuate the image that they had something to hide. They weren't willing to engage with other people, and they were worried about, the kind of reaction that they were going to get. And this just shows you the image that you would get if you inputted search terms related to oil spill. They paid a large sum of money to buy up these search terms on Yahoo, Bing and so on, so that you can see their sponsored link comes up first when you did a search around a number of terms related to oil spill. And from the end of May, BP were estimated to have top visibility for over 1,000 search terms related to oil spill. And their videos were also promoted to the top of the search results for videos on YouTube as well. So through their vast resources, they're able to manipulate how people accessed information. And it's well known that if people input terms into Google, often they will click on the first one that comes up rather than trawling down to other sites. An internal document that was obtained from Advertising Age suggested the corporation went from spending $57,000 a month on search engine optimization advertising to almost 3.6 million just for the month of June, which shows you the kind of scale of resources that was being put into this. And BP were estimated to have spent 3 times as much on their media presence during 2010 as they had done the year before. So, you know, putting very, very large sums of money into trying to deal with the public relations crisis that they were facing. Now, of course, if you look at the challenger groups, so groups like Greenpeace and other environmental NGOs, some of them more locally based in the States, they were far more adept at using social media. And clearly this links in with Castell's theory about mass self-communication. And they made extensive use, particularly of blogs. There's an interesting book that's come out recently by US political scientist, I think she is Melissa Merry, who's done some interesting work around the kind of mediums that NGOs tended to use during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And she found that they tended to make most use of blogs, but also used traditional media as well. And they launched these fake Twitter feeds, which were supposedly from BP, making a lot of use of parody, satire in the way in which they were communicating. And their Boycott BP, Greenpeace's Boycott BP page, had nearly 330,000 fans, many more, hundreds of thousands more than BP's official Facebook page. Of course, there were lots of other means of protest as well. There were flash mobs, attempts to try and encourage people to boycott BP at petrol stations, although that's quite difficult because petrol stations, aren't necessarily, you can't easily do that through petrol stations. And Greenpeace also launched a Rebrand the Logo contest where they asked people to come up with new logos for BP that would kind of show them in a very different light. And that was that proved to be quite a interesting strategy in terms of using Flickr, the photo sharing site, getting people to upload their images. That has longevity because those images stay there for a long time, and also very often there aren't many copyright restrictions, so it means that people can use them again. They appeared on lots of different websites. And they also made use of celebrities like Stephen Fry. They got him to retweet or tweet the logo redesign competition to his 1.5 million followers at the time. So although they didn't have the kind of same financial resources as BP, they had a range of other kinds of resources that they could draw on in terms of their expertise, particularly around using digital media. And another interesting thing that was going on at the time was a number of grassroots groups in the United States who use crowdsourcing and mapping. And location-based services give the ability for environmental groups to document where they visit through using GPS, global positioning system. And this proved to be very useful during the BP oil disaster because they could actually tag particular places that were, particular spots that were affected by the oil spill, and then develop a map. But the downside of that is that using that technology also makes it much easier for the authorities to track individuals and undertake surveillance as well. So it does have its downsides. And another way in which they were able to produce alternative framings was through using DIY, these kind of, you can see here an example of a DIY set. There's one group in particular in the States, grassrootsmapping.org, who developed a set of DIY tools for basically sending inexpensive digital cameras up in helium balloons and kites to generate aerial photographs. So you had these digital cameras, you had a soda bottle tied to them to keep them, weighted, and tied to a balloon, and then they sent them up and they were set to take pictures, at various points. And those images were then often used by journalists because there were a lot of flight restrictions imposed at the time, which meant that you couldn't get close enough to actually take high-resolution images. So they interestingly found that way of getting around those restrictions and producing their own evidence of what was happening. So in terms of sort of making sense of what's going on here, when you're looking at news production, it's often been observed that there's clearly a lot of conflict going on between news sources. So, news sources in terms of environmental organisations, politicians, policymakers, industry and so on, and the media. For Herbert Gans, he describes this relationship as being, a tug of war. They're pulling in opposite directions. They want different things often. And for people like Castells, it's more like a kind of tap dance. So sometimes, that they're kind of moving in the same direction. I don't think either of those analogies is completely satisfactory because, for one thing, we don't have a homogeneous media. Different media outlets obviously act in very different ways, operate under very different constraints and so on. And we certainly don't have a homogeneous environment movement either. There's tremendous differences in terms of different types of environmental organisations or objectives and methods and so on and so forth. So I think, clearly it's important to recognise, as Libby Lester does his, is taken from some of her work that she's done in relation to Tasmania and the Franklin Dam, where she observes there's a raging battle to get on the dance floor in the first place. And this is really what I'm interested in looking behind the scenes at what goes on even before issues hit, even before the media actually covers them. And in the book, one of my arguments is to do with the problem of just assuming that an organisation getting a lot of column inches means that they have influence, or environmental groups, utilising social media, does that necessarily mean that they are actually having a real influence in the policy arena, or does it create an illusion that people are actually contributing to change when maybe what they're doing is quite passive, through clicking links, liking things and so on. So it's really kind of questioning the extent to which media coverage in and of itself is sufficient to bring about actual change in the real world. Power, I think, is also very much about keeping things outside the news, about silence over issues. And if you look at the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, what you see is that BP and the US Coast Guard basically made sure that they escorted photographers and journalists so that they maintained control. So it was very, very controlled over when they could access and what they actually saw. That was heavily managed. And also the flight restrictions that I mentioned earlier as well, which were supposedly on safety grounds, but meant that, initial images of the scale of the disaster were quite limited. There were reports that BP workers themselves had to sign a gagging order in terms of, talking to the media. And also there were claims that CBS News crew were threatened with arrest when they went and did a piece, and clearly wasn't very favourable. And so power, I think, is important to recognise is not just in terms of looking at the media content, but also looking at what's not in the media, and how issues are kept off the agenda is, as important to focus on. I think another thing worth remembering is that although environmental groups have become much better in many ways than huge multinational corporations at using digital media to their advantage, it's sometimes easy to kind of just think that that's all they're doing, but they are using traditional media as well. So it's only one thing in their toolbox. They're using a whole range of different media, not just digital media. And I think that's important to recognise as well. So yes, web mobilisation is important, but we also need to look at how they're targeting mainstream media. And this is an example of how, in the UK, Greenpeace adopted a multi-pronged strategy, and they targeted the Guardian newspaper, which is well known for devoting quite a substantial amount of coverage to environmental issues compared to many of the other elite newspapers. So they placed this advertisement in The Guardian on the 20th of May, accusing Tony Hayward of cutting investment in clean energy and being obsessed with dirty oil. So this was a very much targeted advert in terms of going to The Guardian newspaper, where they knew that a large number of its readers would be more sympathetic towards this than, say, if they placed it in, I don't know, the Financial Times or the Daily Telegraph, for example. Just to kind of finish off now, really, I just want to say something about opinion polls that have been conducted since the Deepwater Horizon disaster. As you can see, the YouGov Economist poll that was undertaken in 2011 suggested that the majority of Americans actually favoured increasing offshore drilling for oil and natural gas, and a relatively small number were in opposition. And again, 2013, slightly more recent Harris poll suggested even higher levels of support. So we have to ask ourselves the question, environmentalists and concerned citizens utilised mass self-communication, but what impact did this have? The key question is how far this impacted on policy and fundamentally changed attitudes towards oil drilling, and it doesn't really appear to have done that. But change, of course, is incremental, and we don't know, over time how it will pan out and whether it will have a more long-lasting effect. But companies like Shell, for example, are carrying on with their oil drilling in the Arctic, and that's generating more campaigns. So time will tell as to what will happen. So just to sum up then, really, these are the key things that I've been looking at. This idea that we shouldn't confuse visibility in the media as necessarily meaning influence. I think it's much more complicated than that. And it's, I think, crucial to focus on looking at the policy-making arena to judge how far a campaign has really been successful. And that's why I think it's very important to not focus all the attention on the media, but to actually look at what's going on beyond that. So to look at a number of different institutions, the policy-making institutions, are very important to consider. Okay, so I think I'll...
Thank you very much, Alison. Any questions, please? Yes.
So, thank you. That was fascinating and really informative. Greenpeace and the green activism, so they were obviously challenging BP.
Yes.
But was there, did their challenge also involve fundamentally challenging their business proposition and proposing alternatives to offshore drilling? So I can understand the need to, you know, the games of the new logo and that they're a bad organisation and isn't this bad and isn't this bad.
Yes, yeah.
Did they present evidence of how they could fundamentally do their business and their servicing differently to in their communications?
I'm not sure that particularly came across in a lot of the mainstream media coverage that they got. I mean, they have suggested alternatives, but a lot of the coverage was focusing more on these kind of media-friendly ways of challenging BP.
So those for switches, no?
Switches, yeah.
So did you find that the switches were the architects of what they would take from the Greenpeace Hotels messages to present in the media, as well as from the BP in the media? So it was sort of we're doing all we can versus you're bad.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I think that's right. I think the switchers, you know, people like Rupert Murdoch clearly do have a huge amount of power, you know, in terms of how the issues are framed. And, you know, if you look at the way in which the elite US newspapers were covering it, I mean, they did tend to, by and large, promote a framing that was sympathetic towards BP. But I mean, there were variations between newspapers as well, but it was the newspapers in the UK, you know, took a very different approach because obviously, you know, it's a different situation, and they were more likely to place emphasis on BP as needing to find a solution, you know, to the whole thing about, you know, blaming BP.
Because to have a policy conversation at a community level, you've got to be talking about options and alternatives rather than...
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well that's very interesting. So what do we do about that? What do we do about the switches determining the content of what everyone hears?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, isn't it? I'm not sure I've got the answer to that.
Any thoughts about what we do about the controlling of the switches?
Yeah.
At a very, very micro scale, there's some of us involved in influencing policy on environment decisions, and we've been working with policy makers on a particular issue for the last 10 years, and we have learnt you just can't say anyone's bad. Like BP, they've got a fiduciary responsibility to protect their reputational risk.
Yes.
So of course they're going to do all this.
Yeah.
That's just, they have to, their shareholders will demand it, so they have to do it. Of course, I'm surprised they didn't ramp it up 10 times more, 3 times more. I thought small. If I was on their board, I'd be ramping it up 10 times. You know, that's what you do. That's your fiduciary responsibility. It's your legal responsibility to deal with that. But, you know, so what we're doing now, very, very small scale stuff, is that to have a policy conversation, you can't say people are bad. You've actually got to materially challenge the business model. You know, where you're saying is the switches architect that conversation, so the conversations about the business model don't make it to the mainstream media, so then the community can't have a policy-related type conversation, so then that can't have, that then you can't create a policy and you need to question that.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Sounds awful, doesn't it?
Was there any media attention on the regulatory space that enabled this kind of disaster to happen, and future policy shifts and regulation shifts, and what tighter controls could be set up in that broader context?
Controls in terms of the media?
In terms of regulative, environmental regulations and so on, compliance for maintenance and so on?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of that, there was, the government have to monitor BP for, I think it's a period of something like 4 years, and there was a new safety regulations are now in place. So from that point of view, those things kind of are in place. But I don't think that necessarily means that, we won't ever see the same kind of thing happen again.
And that issue around understanding crises and what comes from that, and the time frame. So in Australia, we came out of the millennium drought, and we had, I think it's somewhere in the order, nationally, we spent something like $200 billion on desalination plants, which are energy intensive, have lots of environmental implications. And we did that in response, and the Green Groups were really organised around this, angry, a lot of community members were angry. It had variable community support across the country. But what's interesting, 5 years, 10 years on from these decisions, is that some states in Australia have reorientated their policy positions so that that's bought them time, like reacting to that disaster, and are now doing something different. And other states are now buying their third desalination plant. So the decision at the time was unacceptable from a green perspective, but what's happened in the subsequent sort of 5 to 10 years is when we're actually seeing some changes in some places in policy. So I wonder if that might be the case as a consequence of this particular case.
I mean, I think it's perhaps too soon in a way to you need to look at it over a long time period. That's why I say we don't know. In the future, it would be easier to kind of assess what impact it actually had, because these things tend to be sort of incremental anyway.
Thanks, Alison. I liked your reference to the tap dance analogy, but I guess to my way of thinking, I was just wondering whether it's getting even more frenetic, that as we get more and more digital channels for stuff, the volume of information out there is just huge. If you just think about in data terms, there's so many different channels and such volume of data and videos to look at and whatever. I think the average person gets a bit lost, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Greenpeace soundbite or a Friend of the Earth or a BP. It's like, who do I believe here? And I remember quite well Exxon Valdez, and that had quite extensive global coverage for quite a long time. I just wonder, comparing, you can't compare like with like, if you compare one with the other, did Deepwater Horizon get any more coverage than say Exxon Valdez? Open question in my mind.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I like Nick Holdry talks about the super-saturated media landscape. And I think, because of the sheer volume of information that we're now, faced with, inevitably you have to engage in filtering strategies. I think you're absolutely right. And although, studies seem to suggest there was a huge amount of coverage of Deepwater Horizon on cable TV in the US, audiences often aren't particularly attentive. And although there was quite a lot going on in terms of social media, particularly with the environmental NGOs and how they were using digital media, there is a danger that that they're kind of speaking to the converted in a way, and it's not actually getting through to people that haven't got a particular interest in these issues.
And in that 25 years since Exxon Valdez, there've been some very, very major oil spills which have really had extremely little coverage.
Exactly,
I'm thinking of
yes.
Iraq, for example.
Yep, yep.
You know, we're just, well, it's collateral damage, it's a war, stupid, you know.
Yes, yep.
But that was bigger than Exxon Valdez.
Yep, yep.
On some reports, as big as Deepwater Horizon. And
Yep,
Russia just is like, well, they don't even tell people about it. So it's only when someone trips into the oil that they find out about it. But apparently
Yes.
it's huge. So I agree with you that the things that are left out of the media are really important too.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that there are lots of oil spills that haven't got anywhere near the kind of coverage that you'd expect if you were looking at, you know, the extent of damage. And with the Exxon Valdez, it was, you know, partly to do with where that happened, Prince Water Sound, and how that particularly resonated as a wilderness area, and, you know, was special in the hearts of many Americans, and that, I think, partly explains why it got so much coverage. And yet, you know, there are other oil spills that have occurred that really should have, you know, got media coverage and didn't.
Jo?
I'm very interested in the kind of possibilities for social media activism and your well-placed, you know, critique of that. And I just wonder if the only potential is, and I think the lovely thing is that you are separating, you know, policy from actual, you know, numbers or hits or, you know, where the information flow is quite separate from the flow of power. But, you know, so does that mean when we click on these things for various protests or whatever, can we only do it, you know, is it only about consumer choice? Is that the only space where we're allowed to, where it operates? So all of these Greenpeace things were really about BP is a bad person to buy from someone else. Let's wreck their brand by redoing their logo. But it's really just about shopping. That's the only power we've got. It's not reframing the whole debate around, you know, well, do we need oil to run these things, or do we need, you know, do we need to drill in these places? Those questions weren't on the horizon from what I could see, or were they? It was just kind of pictures and brand damagement. The brand damage, yes.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, and there is a danger with that people, you know, we feel like we're having influence, but maybe we're not having as much influence as we really think we are.
Because there's been a lot of controversy about Google's filter bubbles, you know, where, if we can believe some of the claims, because, you know, the profile that Google's able to build up individually, profile stuff, that you're always directed to a very limited amount of information, which did raise the question, because I mean, obviously you're focusing on one side of the equation, there are representations and the visibility, but, you know, in terms of how people consume information, I think many people, I'm just making an assumption here, go online to Google. Well, one doesn't know the links between Google and big companies like, you know, BP, and you know, when you go
well, it becomes clear when you do a search and all of a sudden it's number one, and that's pretty obvious.
But, I mean, that's continuing. We don't know the extent to which that filter bubble is directing us and limiting our horizon. I mean, there's a case at the moment that was just being brought down by the European Commission on what's it called? People's right to be forgotten, which is a very interesting case, and you know, about you know, but you've actually got to let them know. It doesn't happen automatically, and it's not known, and probably not unknowable how many people actually take the initiative to deregister. So it's very interesting, the question you raised about this consumerism. You know, does it all come down to just being an issue of consumer choice from the point of view of Google? They're the ones making the decision about choice. That, you know, the choices have already been predefined as to what you can click on and what sort of information you need to know. I suppose to get a fuller picture, I'm saying the shortcut would be you need to know a lot more about how consumers actually get their information. You know, because that last bit of information about, you know, from the survey, showing people are not opposed, perhaps you could take from that the suggestion, well, they're consuming information in a way which is pre-designed for them not to know many
Yes.
other issues about the impacts of offshore drilling, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
wanted to know more about that last slide about those people's opinions on drilling. I'd want to know, like, what were the sources of their media that they consumed that then came to this conclusion that drilling is still a great idea. And were they Americans or were they?
Americans.
Okay,
Yeah.
because you were saying that
Yeah.
the whole debate was framed quite significantly differently
Yes.
in England. So it would
Yes.
be interesting to do a kind of a comparison
It would.
of
Yeah.
those framings of the debates and then to see if there's any kind of influence or shaping of opinion
Yeah,
through that.
yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure whether Pew did any analysis of the kind of media that those particular survey respondents, were using and how that might have. I mean, they have done some work on media coverage, so I don't know whether they've matched that up with the work that they've done on public opinion. But I think that would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah. To look at that. Yeah.
BP seemed to get smarter with time, I thought. I mean, to begin with,
Yeah.
the Twitter and YouTube was
Yeah.
almost like the Keystone Cops or something. It was a bit comical.
Yes,
But then
yeah.
they seemed to sort of ramp up their
Yes.
cleverness very quickly and
Yeah,
got
yeah,
social media
yeah.
savvy.
Yeah. Certainly over time, they did get more media savvy, but it took a long while to kind of reach that
But
point.
it's interesting that money doesn't necessarily equal being media savvy.
No,
because,
no,
like, they
no.
put that phenomenal amount of money into social media, and yet Greenpeace had done very little in terms of putting money into it, and was so successful just through their networks and strategic sort of actions.
Yeah.
It's
That
interesting.
is their business case though, isn't it? They've got to be highly capable in that space already before the crisis. That would be their mode of operation mainly, wouldn't it? That would be
Yeah,
their
yeah.
business, where BP's,
Yeah.
they don't have a business of engaging with the everyday person,
No.
or maybe it's not part of their
Yeah.
business case to
I mean,
do that.
you saw exactly the same thing happen with the Brent Spa as well with Shell, that they were just largely reactive and they were
Yeah.
completely unprepared.
Yeah.
So,
But we have an organization in Australia, Get Up, who actually in the beginning, they focused on just a single policy, and they managed to change the political landscape in a little bit, but just target one little bit part of it. Especially in the beginning, they were quite good at it, but I don't know now, but I mean, there was a lot of, several hundred people was following them over the internet, and it was just an internet organization, but they specify exactly just one little bit and try to change the product. So that goes again, if you target very specifically, you might have an influence.
I really like your critique of the possibilities of the democratization of the social media and the new media in particular, and I think that's very necessary because this idea that Facebook and Twitter have sparked the Arab Spring and all that kind of rubbish probably is necessary. But I also, in the discussion, I sense a bit of cynicism in terms of it is still the big business that controls all the communication. BP just buys off Google and then, or otherwise, it still really is a consumer choice. Like you mentioned, even if you have the choice, you only have the choice between two market competitors, and you're still stuck in that system. So I wonder, is there any research, or maybe you have an opinion on that matter? Is there any thoughts on the real possibilities that new media and the internet have brought us? Because I think in lots of areas there have been revolutions in how the businesses operate, and I think computing itself is the prime example where the big businesses, the really big IT companies, were just swept aside by open source people that were able to organize themselves through the internet, which wouldn't have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. Is there an equivalent in politics?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's something I didn't mention actually, but the potential, for organising protests and just coordinating with people across the world, which we kind of often take for granted now. But if we didn't have that, then environmental movements wouldn't be anywhere near as effective as potentially they can be now. So I mean, it probably sounds a bit pessimistic, but actually, there are ways in which digital media, can be really, key, for environmental movements.
Especially about this framing issue, that BP spent a lot of money and effort into reframing this disaster in a way that they could get away with it, or even, you know, ramp up their business. But also, in this day and age, with all the communication around, everybody sees it, so everybody has the possibility to actively be involved in this framing. So is there, and Greenpeace obviously stepped into that arena and did a bit of framing themselves, and I think it shouldn't be neglected in the analysis that these possibilities are now also around, whereas in 100 years ago, you would, I think you mentioned that it would have been a byline in the newspaper.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we have got many more alternative framings available to us. It's just that I think sometimes there's a danger that, you know, the environmental movement can be mainly talking to the converted, and it doesn't unfortunately reach beyond that. And it's, I mean, sometimes it does, but, you know, it can end up being quite narrowly focused.
Yeah, this is true, especially since, because of the overwhelming presence of media, people, I don't think people filter actually. I think just people engage in a different way with new media. You just listen to your friends, whether that is in real life or on Facebook. So they tell you what news to look at, and you click the links that they click and that kind of thing. So that naturally leads to the effect where people only talk to the people they already like. And if they like Greenpeace, they will know about their message, and if they don't like Greenpeace, that message will not reach them maybe. So
I mean, I think the other complicating thing is there's no clear distinction anymore between the online and offline worlds. You know, they're constantly interacting, so
that's true.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of separate them out anymore.
But it's interesting, that paradox, isn't it? Almost like we see the internet as somehow the sort of the greatest example of a network society, and yet in some ways people are just engaging in their own little networks on the internet without really networking in any other sort of broader sense. So it's like a society of cliques rather than a network society. It's interesting that it can start to work that way.
Yes, yeah, I'd agree. Yeah.
I know your focus was around disasters. I'm just curious to know whether there are similar patterns that came out in any other disasters, if you've looked at others beyond this, the oil spill. Because as I was listening, I was brought to mind of an online campaign around sort of preempting massive construction projects or massive developments such as foresting and coal mining off the Great Barrier Reef, where online campaigns have sort of mustered around targeting the banks, so the business case that Rebecca was alluding to, actually influencing their financial channels as well. So it sort of is before a potential risk actually comes about. So I was just, have you looked at anything sort of before potential risks happen?
That's really interesting. No, I haven't. But yeah, that would be fascinating to do, wouldn't it? Actually looking before, Yeah,
because it certainly happened in Tasmania, and I know it's only just briefly read about it in the paper the other day about the Great Barrier Reef and a few of the major banking companies pulling out of funding coal mining up there because of online support for, looking at. I suppose that it shows the power of the networks and the existence of the online community, because people are responding to it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly business, is monitoring what's going on in those arenas. So from that point of view, they're trying to kind of keep in step with what's going on in terms of public concerns.
So is that a reputational risk? Is that the kind of driving force?
I think so. I mean, these were Swedish investors, Dutch investors in the Tasmanian case, from what I understood, and certainly their perception and their risk and reputation of what the Australian community thought, and that's overseas. It's not even here. So that's something my limited understanding of.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect. It's kind of screening for public. Potential public concerns, and then acting on the basis of that, which is a more kind of indirect influence. But I think that's really important.
Did you have something to say?
I was just really to add to that point, the big banks now have sort of the big ones have their ethical investment funds now, and they're growing as a higher proportion, and governments are looking at what they're doing with the superannuation funds and looking at potentially investing it in non-dirty businesses and things like that. So that, you know, and then in Australia we have the ASX, and so there are corporate reporting requirements for corporate social reporting. You have the same in the UK and they don't have too much teeth, but their teeth are increasing, and these seem to have quite some influence on the greenwashing advertising in quite a lot of these organisations, but it seems over time it is seeping in some sectoral areas, but obviously oil and coal is the hardest. The hardest to capture. And that's come from activism of organisations like Greenpeace and so forth, but I don't really know the role of the media.
No.
In that space of trying to influence change and be precautionary.
Yeah, I mean, that's not something I particularly looked at, but I know it is an area of growing interest, and I think you're right, you know, gradually it's having more influence.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope so. I hope so.
I think that point that you made about can you pick the point at which something goes from being not an issue in the media to something does is really interesting.
Yes.
I've been looking a lot at the long-term future of fossil fuels and fracking particularly. Fracking is a huge issue in the US in the media of arguments and counter-arguments, and it has been here. And I was following a little bit in Europe and noticed there was some emerging negative media and discussions about it. But it was quite amazing last year to see how quickly it's got on the agenda in the UK. I don't know if you've noticed it, but in the last 12 months, the Department of Energy moved very quickly to commission a whole lot of reports. And they've got a whole section on their website, which is both very offensive and defensive. So they've got reports commissioned by, I don't know, some international institute of auditors or something, claiming huge financial benefits and employment and rejuvenation of rural areas. It's ridiculous numbers. They've got reports by the Royal Society and the Royal Geological Society saying how prospective it is and how it's going to, make the chemical industry in the UK boom again, like in the US. But there was a lot of negative stuff about occupational health and safety. It's not going to harm people. It's not going to damage the environment. It's not going to pollute water. It's not going to damage the So in the space of a year, they've gone from being it's almost like they've looked at the US and Australia or other places and gone, we need to be prepared for this. So it's really sort of, and even though no one's actually doing fracking, I don't think in the UK at the moment, but they're certainly drilling for it. So it's quite extraordinary.
What did the market sensitisation or something, where you go in and you start working over the customers before the product's even there?
Yeah, there's probably a
I'm sure there is. I can't.
Well, sort of some people call it anticipatory politics, where it's, and saying that nanotech, isn't it, really? They said not another, in the UK, as that nanotechnology became more visible about 2003, there's a lot of discussion about we don't want another GM, because it was the failed GM nation public debate, which got was seen to be hijacked by the Greens, wasn't it? And so, the whole response to nanotechnology was sort of based on the premise that, it's sort of a risk management and anticipatory governance, let's not let this happen. All the public, they had a whole lot of public engagement initiatives, to try and, in my view, to stem that kind of public. That was the risk, was the public response, rather than the biophysical risk. That's what I feel anyway. And yet that's all petered out now, isn't it?
And that seems, I mean, if that was the intention, it seems to have been quite successful, really, because there is very little public interest in in the issues.
So do we have any other questions or points? No? Well, maybe we could wrap it up at this point, and thank you very much for your very probing insights and questions. I should have mentioned at the outset too, today is being filmed, and the reason we're doing that is because TASA has very kindly agreed through the office to upload today's proceedings onto the website so the broader audience can have access to it. And I asked Alison ahead of time, she was very happy for it to be recorded. So I hope you are too. I mean, we're not necessarily interested in your detail. You can probably black out your face like they do in other plates with Google. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Alison, for that wonderful talk.